G'day guys, in this video I'm going to go through a full 12 volt setup from the starter battery into the canopy on an aluminium headboard. I'm going to mount everything. So that's a DC-DC charger, an inverter. I've got a Bluesea Safetyhub 150 for DC distribution, and I'll be going through cable selection, Corrie heat shrink lugging, fuse selection, and just general wiring practices and stuff like that. Okay, so I'm just going to interrupt the video there. This video is now going to be split in two parts. Part one is going to be basically from the start until we get to this point with everything mounted and the planning for all our wiring. So we're doing a complete circuit from the starter battery all the way back into the canopy through DC-DC charger, through a fuse box distribution hub. We've got fuses, inverters, display. In part one, I'll go through all the equipment that I've got, the reasoning behind purchasing it, comparing it to some alternatives, cost and weight wise. I'll go through the layout, the drilling and mounting of things. I'll go through how to use a nutsert tool, and using single line diagrams and the instructions, having an understanding of the wiring and why that is important in how we lay out the mounting. And then part two is going to be about running the wiring, terminating it, and then going through the circuitry, the cable size, fuse size, volt drop, why I chose the cable sizes that I did, and how everything is going to work together once it's all installed. So first things first, I'll just go through everything that I've got here. So when it came to DC-DC charger, I went for the Redarc BMS1230. I brought this in a kit, which is the Redarc BMS1230S3R. Now what the R stands for is Red Vision display, so it comes with the Red Vision display. Now I wouldn't normally recommend the Redarc BMS30 for a lot of people. I'd actually recommend the Enerdrive 40 amp DC-DC charger. The BMS30 is limited to 30 amp charge, whereas that Enerdrive 40 amp DC-DC will push 40 kind of as a minimum, unless it really overheats. Sometimes you'll even get 50 amps charge out of that. So if you had a really big battery system and you wanted it to charge as quick as possible, I wouldn't go with the BMS30. The other reason I'd avoid the BMS30 ordinarily is because of the price of it. Redarc gear is always expensive, but this is what you can pick up an Enerdrive 40 amp DC-DC charger and an Enerdrive 40 amp AC charger for, and this is what the Redarc BMS30 costs you. So on the one hand, this is cheaper, but you've got to do a little bit more wiring, but you only have to do that once. This will charge everything a lot quicker because you get 40 amp DC and 40 amp AC charging. This is a smaller footprint, it's a little bit neater, it has green power priority. The BMS30 will actually take from solar before it takes from your alternator. The Enerdrive system won't do that. It will only take from solar if it's not getting a feed from the alternator. Neither of these systems are waterproof, so you can't mount them in an engine bay. They need to be mounted inside the car, inside the cab, or inside a canopy, somewhere where it's not going to be exposed to too much dust, vibration, and obviously water. If I wouldn't recommend this to people, then why did I buy it? So I wouldn't have got this, but it was on special, so I got it for about $500 or $600 off just before tax time, and there's a few tax time specials going around. So for me, I wouldn't have bought it if it wasn't on special, and even when it was on special, it was a close call because I could have easily just gone with Enerdrive. Small footprint, the really good display. So one day I could add water tank sensors into this display as well. I got a 60 litre water tank under the canopy. The fact that it was on special, the solar priority, these things just sort of tip the scales, but any other day I actually would have gone for the Enerdrive setup. It wouldn't look as neat, but the price and the increased output, it's just hard to beat. Now for the battery, I've got the Enerdrive B-Tect 125 Lithium, 125 amp hours. It gives you 100 usable amp hours if you discharge 80% depth of discharge. So I was always going to go lithium just because of the weight saving factor and the amount of charge cycles that you get out of it. This 100 amp usable will be more than enough for me for a while. Combining this with a solar panel, I don't think this will ever let me down. One of the main reasons I got this is I actually found it on Marketplace. I scored this for $1,100, which is pretty cheap because they go for probably $1,600 or $1,700 brand new. Good thing about buying these secondhand is these have the Bluetooth, so I could connect via the app and I could see that it only had 10 charge cycles at the time I purchased. So basically brand new. Got the Bluesea Safetyhub 150. This is the same style that I mounted in the engine bay to be the distribution hub in the engine bay. And the reason I went for this, again, gives you flexibility. It's got MIDI fuses and it's got ATO fuses. So I can run circuits up to 200 amps off this, depending on the size of the cable that I feed this with, because that will change the overall output, but heaps of flexibility. It's got a negative bus bar, which I really like because I want all the negatives to come back to one central point with a proper connection, not so much through the chassis. This will be my distribution hub in the canopy. I've got the exact same one mounted in the engine bay. So I picked up this one a little bit cheaper than the one I got in the engine bay. This was about $175. Most of the time you have to pay probably closer to $200 for these. So for the inverter, I've got the Enerdrive 600W. And the reason I've gone for such a small inverter is because I basically added up all the loads that I thought I might possibly need, 240 volt loads, things that need 240 volt power, or I would like to use 240 volt power for just because they charge quicker than they would with a USB-C. Things like my laptop and my drone, for example. Added up all the wattages combined, figured out the size I would need if for some reason in theory I needed to charge all of them at once, which wouldn't happen anyway, but it's good to have that sort of built into the system. And the other reason I went for the small one is cheaper, less weight, and it limits the strain on the battery. The batteries, if you want a high amperage output, you actually have to upsize as well. So this 125 amp hour lithium probably would be fine with a 1000 watt inverter, but if you wanted to go to a 2000 watt inverter, even though you might not need 200 amp hours of capacity, you would need a 200 amp hour battery just for the continuous discharge rates that they offer. So 600 watt, nice and safe for the battery, and the battery management system can supply that output consistently. It's lighter, it's cheaper, and it limits what I will install in the car for a while. It'll keep the setup in the back of the car a little bit more modest, and it'll just basically be used for charging cameras and possibly running small power tools. So in this video, I'm not going to cover the actual wiring of a 240 volt circuit. I'm just covering the actual install, the cables onto here, and the mounting of this. So the first step of this job, before I mount the DC-DC charger and start running cables, is mounting the battery. And the reason for that is the battery is the heaviest item, and that's the one that I want to dictate where everything else works around it. And I get the battery in first, then I can mount the DC-DC charger as close as possible. So I want the cable runs in between everything to be as short as possible. And only once they're all mounted, then I'll run the cables from the engine bay, because the final positions are set and nothing's going to change. And when I chop and lug my cables, I won't get caught short anyway. Okay, time for everyone's favourite part. Let's weigh stuff. I'm going to start with the lithium. So the battery, the tray that holds it, and the strap. Just wait till it stops rocking, but it shouldn't change too much. 15.47 kilos. The inverter, 2.407. So at the end I'll weigh whatever doesn't get installed, obviously, so the box will get subtracted from that weight. The Redarc system with the display on top, 5.107. The Bluesea Safetyhub 150, 711 grams. Now for all my nuts and bolts, I've been to a local fastener store. Everything goes in the box. I've got a bunch of cable grommets here in the box, some heat shrink that I might use, all of my lugs, some fuses, got an A&L fuse holder, sticky back cable tie points, a bunch of nuts and bolts that I might take from, some more lugs, bushings, inline MIDI fuse kit. The nutsert kit comes with a bunch of nutserts, so these will all go in the box. 5.019 kilos. In this bag I have all of my cable. This is my dual wall heat shrink cable grounds. This is for entry into the canopy. And I'm going to be sticking this non-split tubing in there for weighing as well. 5.343 kilos. Just quickly, another addition to the weight is all this split corrie that I forgot to weigh before. So I might use up bits and pieces of this, so there's another 400 grams. So as with everything in this build, I've tried to keep it as light as possible. The BT50 is already a heavy car as far as dual cabs go. Not in the grand scheme of things, but as far as dual cabs go, the Ford Rangers and BT50s are on the heavier end. So I've been trying to reduce weight wherever possible. So I've gone lightweight canopies and making decisions like getting a lithium over an AGM. That's a real big weight saver. So I was pretty stoked to pick this up second hand with basically no charges on it. You get 2000 plus cycles out of these, about 15 kilos, and you get 100 amp hours usable. So the equivalent for an AGM battery, I'll show you up here, that's the equivalent weight and roughly the same equivalent cost, but you don't get as many charge cycles and you're carrying all that weight around. And on top of that, these will charge so much quicker. They can take a lot of input. Just from a quick drive, you'll put a lot more charge into your lithium battery than you would with an AGM battery. Besides the cost, which is really the only downside to the lithiums, they outshine the AGM batteries in every single way. They can discharge deeper, they charge up faster, they have more cycles, and they're a lot lighter. So I'll happily pay a little bit more for lithium. Alright guys, so just in the back of the canopy here, you see I've got the lithium here. I want to slide this as far forward as I can, which is basically where it is now. It is sitting just underneath this headboard. I can raise this headboard because it's just in channel strut, so I can actually raise that if I need to. I'm going to cut out the rubber matting where this is going to sit, so it's actually going to drop 10 mil anyway. And you can see on the floor here, I have this masking tape. The outside edge of this masking tape is where I plan on installing my fridge. Well, not the fridge, but the cage that goes around the fridge. They are the outer dimensions, so that is one thing I have to plan for. That is the only thing that's going to dictate where the battery sits, because it needs to be as far this way as it sort of can be. So I want everything to work around the battery, but the fridge takes precedence over the battery. So that'll go roughly where it's sitting now. I'll cut this rubber matting out, and everything else can sort of work around that. I want to keep the battery as far forward as we can, and ideally it'll be as central as it can be, as close to this fridge as it can be. Now, if I ever was to upgrade, the excess length of a new battery would push out that way, obviously, and probably this way. It wouldn't impede on the fridge. Now, when it comes to mounting the battery, you just got to be careful of what you've got underneath. I've got a 60 litre water tank underneath, so I don't have access through there to nut and bolt. Because this is aluminium, I can drill through this without ever worrying about corrosion. So there's a few options. So you could use a double-sided adhesive tape and either build it up thicker than these feet or simply place it on these feet only. Another option is using a self-drilling screw. These are made to tap into metal. Because this floor has a decent thickness to it, you'll actually get plenty of thread engagement there, as long as you have a shallow enough depth. Don't go through the water tank underneath. Another option, when you can't nut and bolt something, because you can't get to the other side of it, is using a nutsert kit. I'll go through the use of this because I'm going to be using this on the headboard for some items, just so I don't have to nut and bolt around the back and I can unscrew things from the front. What this is basically, think of a pop rivet, except the pop rivet inserts a nut. You just screw a bolt in and it goes through this nut. Works the same as a pop rivet, except it is a threaded entry. So you can actually screw bolts in here, goes in this side. The nutsert gun will pinch this and it will collapse itself either side of the sheet metal and prevent this from spinning. So for this battery tray, I'm going to use 4 self-drilling screws. The reason is it is quicker to install, and if I ever want to change to a larger battery, which will come with a larger battery tray, I can remove these screws and there is nothing left in the floor of the canopy. Sikaflex it up, it's nice and smooth and waterproof. These will have heaps of engagement because the floor is quite thick. For some of the items on the headboard, I'll be using the nutsert kit. Battery is installed. So the battery is mounted, that's the easy part of the job. Now what we're going to do is take all the stuff in the car and sort of see how we want to lay it out. Then we're going to remove the headboard from the car, bring the headboard out, we're going to mount everything out here and run any wiring that never exits the headboard. So if it goes from the headboard to something else on the headboard, we'll wire it all out here. And then at the end, we can put the headboard back on with all the accessories, and then we can connect any wiring that comes from or departs the headboard to go somewhere else. The advantage of doing this obviously is because you have more space around you. If you have everything installed as one unit, everything that is local to the headboard, then you can drill, you can grommet, you can heat shrink and lug all out in the open, and you can get all your cables and all your spacing done perfectly. So this part here is the hardest part of the job. This is the planning. What you need to do is draw everything out. Write down a list of cable sizes, cable lengths, and each connection point. You need to write down the lug size or the bootlace size or the ring terminal size. Everything that you need, have it written down. Create a little shopping list for yourself. That includes A&L fuse holders, MIDI fuse holders, fuses themselves, the cable, any non-split corrie or split corrie, everything. When you write it all down, look at the instructions for everything that you're installing. because that could affect how you actually plan out the job. I'll show you an example in my case. I did my original shopping list off a rough single line that I'd done without actually looking at the instructions for the Redarc BMS1230, and then a new list that I had to make up after I actually looked at the instructions and saw how it was wired. There's a few lugs that were missing just because of the way things had to be wired. I needed a few extra lugs and stuff like that. So I'll show you that now. My initial shopping trip to get cable was sort of off this plan here. I recommend going through the instructions of whatever you've got, looking at how the wiring needs to be done in practice, because I had to change a few things. It didn't work out too bad. There's only about 2 or 3 lugs that I didn't have in the end. So this is my final draft, and you can see the 25x6s there. They're the lugs. 4G, that's a cable size. That's American wire gauge or BNS cable. So when you work out your cable sizes and your lugs, then you can create your own shopping list. Don't forget to accommodate all fuses and stuff. So I've got an A&L fuse holder there and all the cable sizes. This was the final draft and the final wiring diagram. So for the mounting stage, the only thing we need to keep in mind here is that the shorter the cable run, the better within reason. So I'll go through volt drop, cable size, fuse sizes as I go to install each part. But for this part where we're just getting our layout organised, the thing that we need to keep in mind is the shorter we can keep all these cable runs, the better. We have less losses and less chance of damage. If we keep the cable run simple, there's less chance of anything going wrong with it. Nice smooth bends. We're going to mount everything close to each other. They don't have to be as close as you can possibly get them, but if we mount everything in a central location, your cable runs will be shorter, less volt drop, and less opportunity for anything to go wrong. So I'm going to unbox some of this stuff and just sort of hold it up against the headboard and see what it looks like. I'll mark where the battery is on the headboard, and then I'll remove the headboard itself. So once you understand the wiring and the sequence of the wiring, then you can start positioning things around the battery, just keeping in mind areas that might be inaccessible later, like where I'm sitting. If I had a fridge cage here, I'm not really going to be able to access this sort of area. So if I have the BMS1230 sitting behind here, that'll be good because it's not really blocking anything and it's just taking up an otherwise inaccessible space. So in this box we have the display. The display can basically go wherever you want it. You can even wire it into your cab if you want. I'm going to mount it up here. The BMS1230 and the shunt are two of the things that need to be as close to the battery as possible. The house battery negative will go to this shunt, so you want to keep that run short, and the DCDC charger, or the BMS1230, will feed the battery positive, so we want to keep that short. The other side of this shunt gets wired into the battery manager as well. So in theory, I could have something like this, leaving a little bit of height on top of everything, just in case I change out this battery one day for a taller one, and leaving enough spacing to get a nice curve on all of your cables. So it could be something quite similar to this. DC hub probably sit somewhere quite central because it'll be fed from battery positive. Negative buzz bar will go to the ground on the shunt here. So we've got to think about how that will sit. And the only other thing I've got left is the inverter. Now the inverter, I'm actually feeding through the DC hub. So I'm going to keep it just to the side of it with the DC connections on the inside of the canopy and having the power point, the GPO, pointing to the outside. So it'll be mounted roughly around here somewhere, just to keep those cable runs extremely short. So that's my general way of thinking. I'll have display, inverter, DC hub, shunt, BMS1230. Then eventually I'm going to get some USB-C and USB-A outlets down here, and off the inverter I'll probably just run a power board which will be mounted here somewhere. I'm going to mark this center of the battery just so I remember when I put it on the table where the battery will be sitting. Just be careful if you do have a battery with exposed terminals. If I was to short this aluminium across there, that would give quite a large bang and spark. Just be careful when you're working around a battery because batteries obviously have power. I'll actually remove this from the canopy until I'm ready to make those terminations. And the only other thing to consider is what you have behind. So obviously far right and far left I've got strut, and I also have strut in the middle here with a 20mm gap to that strut. So that shouldn't be an issue with a 20mm gap. So I've got the aluminium headboard mounted on these 4 pavers here, just to give it a bit of elevation when I need to drill through. So I won't go into too much detail about the mounting of these, I'll just show you what it looks like when it's done. Have your plan ready to go with the instructions, and then we can start marking up. And you can see I've made 2 little marks. That is the edges of the battery. and that way I'll know how I want to mount everything. After about an hour of rearranging, I had two main ideas that kept popping up, and this is all based around the ease and the short of the cable runs. Because I knew all my cable sizes and that, I just bought a random grommet kit. I've just been making sure each cable that I plan on penetrating this aluminium sheet is going through a grommet that is going to fit. So I'm going to mark everything, and then I'll drill everything at once. So I've got heaps of drilling to do. That's the downside of working with this aluminium headboard. When you're working with timber, it's a little bit easier. You don't have to put grommets in, so there's a lot more work involved in this in the mounting stage. I had one other arrangement, which was worse for the negative but better for the positive. And then this arrangement, which is worse for the positive in the sense that it's got to go further. It's a bit more awkward, but it's better for everything else. So this is the final one I went with. The Redarc BMS1230 is kind of as far left as I can push it. It'll be behind the fridge eventually when I have a fridge, but I'll still be able to access the terminals from the center of the canopy. A lot of these grommets, it's just for future circuits that I might add onto here and future little negatives that I might add onto this bus bar, but some of these grommets won't be in use. I don't think I need the ignition trigger, and I'm not going to have any essential loads at this point, but I wanted to put some extra grommets in just to make it easier on myself later on down the track. So I can start drilling and wiring everything up now. I just got to find what drill bit sizes these are, and then as per usual, draw a little diagram. I'm going to forget, so I need to mark what each hole is, where it is, and the size of drill bit that I want to go through with. So it might look a bit random at the moment, but this will all make sense once the cables are in. This has been designed to allow the shortest possible cable runs, but also leave enough on some of these larger cables to form the cable in. You don't want really tight bends with pressure on the mounting points. You want the bend to be nice and smooth. If you bend the cable too tight, you also restrict the current flow, and the cable will get warmer and it will be less efficient. Just marked and punched everything. That includes all the grommets as well as the mounting points. I've got all the different holes that I need to drill, just so when I move everything and go through everything with a pilot bit, I know what the final size has to be. So I've got the sizes written next to all the grommets. So using the vernier calipers, if I can do this with one hand. So for the M5 rivnuts, we'll be drilling about a 7mm hole. If you have a step drill bit like this, it'll be a lot easier to go through with the grommets. Just keep punching this through until the grommet fits. So I'll drill a pilot bit through every hole, whether it's a nutsert or a grommet. For the grommets, I'll go through with this. So once you've got all your pilot bits done, we can go through with the plan and drill to the appropriate size. If you've ordered your grommets individually, you'll know the inner diameter, the outer diameter, the width of the gap and everything. If you ordered it in a kit, you probably won't get those details. You just get the diameter of the hole. So before I go and drill everything, I'll do a test of each size just to make sure that it's correct. So I've got 3 different rivnut sizes to do, and I've got 4 different grommet sizes to do. What the rivnut will do is turn this into a rivet with a thread inside. So the rivnut tool, you have different attachments for each size of nut that you want to rivet in. So pop this collar down. So I'll take off this attachment, pop this collar down, and you can undo the internal attachment. These are the 2 parts that we'll have for the M6. M6, long thread up, wind it in until it's hitting there, and then that collar is activated with this. We just want to get that until it clips over. That will stop that spinning out. Got our M6, fit this on here. Now inside the rivnut you have a thread that will thread on here. Widen your handles, exposes more thread, thread it on all the way. You have a little bit of that threaded rod coming through. We insert it into the hole. Now we want this to sit as flat as possible when we rivet it. Now we squeeze those handles together. Remove the tool from the nut using this. Now you don't have to squeeze the handles all the way together. The thicker the sheet, the less you'll have to squeeze it. And the smaller the rivnut, like with an M4 for example, you don't need to squeeze it as hard. The mechanism that is riveting this is using that thread. So this rod here is using that thread as the grip to pull this rivet in and pinch it. If you overwork those handles, you can actually strip that thread. So that's especially important on the M4s or the M3s if you ever use a smaller size. Here's the finished product, all the nutserts and grommets. You might be able to see there how the nutserts clamp on. Okay, so that took a couple hours just drilling, trying to get the right sizes. The hardest part about that was these rubber grommets. Nutserts are pretty easy, to be honest. In hindsight, I wouldn't have gone with rubber grommets. I would have got a set of nylon bushings. The nylon bushings, you only have to drill them once and you just clip them in. This 2.5mm plate is pushing what you can achieve with these grommets because the slot is a little bit too thin on some of them. So it's a lot of work to try and push them in and work the lips out with a screwdriver. And even then, they don't sit 100% as well as I would have liked. The nutserts worked out well. So now I'm going to mount it and then we'll start wiring everything that is local to the headboard only. And then we can put that in the car and then we can wire everything else out. This video is now going to be split into two parts because it is becoming a bit bigger than I originally imagined it would be. This is the end of part one. Now at this stage, we are ready to start running cables. That will be part two. I'm going to be this whole package is a smaller fit. So the small footprint mounted in the canopy. The BT50 voltage on there. Could be something quite slimmer. That's a rough sort of guide. There might be a little bit of